class, welcome to General Psychology. I am Professor Moore and I am super excited to be with you guys for the next 10 weeks. So this is basically an introduction to psychology class, so you don't really need to have a background in psychology to take this course. This is the course that will give us that fundamental foundation in psychology that you will just build upon as you continue taking more psychology classes. So what I want to do in this lecture is just quickly walk us through our Canvas shell and then go over our lecture notes, just a little introduction to psychology. I'll talk a little bit about the different theorists and go into the history of psychology. And then we'll also look at some of the key scientific points of psychology. So let's start in our Canvas shell. So alright, if you have found this video, that means you have already made it to our Canvas shell. Good job on that. So I don't want to take too much time walking us through all of this because I'm confident that all you guys can go in and play around and figure this out, but there are a couple things that I do want to point out. So best practice is whenever you first begin a course, and it's always going to open on the home page, and the best practice is to always go and click that Start Here button, and at least once go through. It walks you through all the pages, and it's just a good way for you to be able to navigate and get used to the Canvas part of our classroom. So like I said, I'm not going to walk us through that, but basically when you hit that Start Here button, what it does is it takes you, starting with the syllabus, it'll take you right to the syllabus, and then you just go and you hit next page, and it walks you through each of these little links here on the tree on the left. So like I said, just do that Start Here button once, and then once you kind of get used to that, a quick easy way to go and figure out what's going on in class is just to click on the syllabus. And it's really cool here. There's this cool little calendar feature at the top of the syllabus page, and it highlights all our due dates. All you have to do is just click on that due date. It automatically takes you down to page to where what assignments are due that week, and then you can just click on those links, and that'll take you to the assignment instructions and the drop boxes for those assignments. So real quickly here, let me note, since I have this up, you will see that this week I want you guys to get that icebreaker activity submitted online. I will also have a couple handouts and then a AIT test that you guys are going to go take and you'll submit online. I will have that drop box set up for you once I get this lecture up in the announcements post. So basically I had that icebreaker activity set to be due today, the first day of class, but since it's a holiday we're not meeting. I want you guys to do that little write-up and submit it online. And then what we'll do next week when we first get together in class is we'll actually go over those and kind of, try to guess who said what. And it's a little fun way for us to all get to know each other. Alright, and then next you'll notice that there is a journal exercise 1 that is due on Sunday. And then if you go through, you'll see that almost all of the assignments always have a Sunday due date. Our weeks run from Monday to Sunday. So Monday is always the first day of the week, first day of a module, and then Sunday is always the last day of the module. So I always set it up for you guys to do get your assignments sent in on the last day of the week, because then that gives you all week to, ask me any questions if you're having any trouble with anything. That gives you time to, see me in class if we need to talk about or go over anything in class before you guys would submit that. Whatever you guys need, I am here for you, and I want you guys to feel comfortable and reach out to me with anything in class. We can work anything out as long as you guys communicate with me, as long as you get your assignments submitted. I am willing to help you in any way possible. I'll give you the answers all day long, but I can't submit your work for you, so as long as you can do that for me and you can come to class, I'm willing to help you be successful in any way that I possibly can. Alright guys, so one last thing I want to, just make sure you go through all of that. And then one last thing I want to point out here is the announcement link. This is if you've already watching this video, you've already figured out the announcement link. But what I want to point out is that best practice with this too is at least check the announcements once a week. I will put up important information. As you already see, I have like resources up for class. I'll have our PowerPoint lectures that we'll go over each week. I'll put those up before class. And I will fix that. I accidentally put the wrong welcome note in there. This is not human growth and development. Sorry guys, I'll fix that before you guys get into class, and as you're reading this it won't look like that. And so just make sure you check in there. Oh, also I want to note, make sure that everybody goes in and reads this food and drink policy, and you go in and you respond to the discussion question. I don't think I put a lock date on that, but if you guys could do that by Sunday, I would really appreciate that. And it's just a way to help the university see that you guys are participating in both parts of class, and it's just a way for us to, let the university know that we're all aware of their policies. So alright, that's all I want to show us in our Canvas shell for right now. And the next thing that I want to point out is, oh wait, let me show you this real quick. In our announcements right here, you will see this one called Mindfulness Practice, Creating Space for Your Schoolwork. Make sure that you go through and you read through that, and I would encourage you to try the practice on your own. There is a video there with the breathing exercise in it. That is an exercise that we will do at the beginning of every class, and the purpose of the exercise is just to help get us in that right frame of mind, help create that right mental space to where we're open and alert and we're focused on the task at hand, and we're able to concentrate on talking about general psychology, and we're not worried about all that other stuff that's always going on in our head. So it's just a good little way to clear all that stress of the day out of our minds and help us to focus on what we're doing in class. And it's even a practice that, it can really apply to anything that you do in life. So make sure you guys read that. Try it. We will start each class with that. So next week, that'll be the first thing we do in class. So if you have any questions about that, we could certainly, or if you need me to explain it anymore, I could certainly do that in class next week before we go and we start doing that as a group. So alright, here, let's just get into it. So psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. So what does that mean? Basically what we're saying is that psychology studies the mind and body connection, or we could say it studies how we think, we act, and we engage each other, because it is, because we do see that the way we think really does have an effect on how we behave, and then in turn, that influences how we engage each other. Alright, so psychology is actually derived from the Greeks, the actual word, the origin, or the etiology of the word there, which would be like the kind of root cause, but the root word there, and it actually means the study of the soul. And when it comes down to it, psychology really didn't become a scientific field until the 19th century, but it's actually a very old field, because we see way back into prehistory that people of all cultures throughout all of humanity have always asked, these questions about what it means to be human. These questions, why are we here? Who are we? Why do we think what we think? Why do bad people do bad things? And, what's morality? What's ethics? All of that, everything that relates to what it means to be human, and is basically what we are looking at in psychology. And that's really something that we do with all the liberal arts and social science fields. And the reason we do that is because they kind of all started out as the same field way back in the beginning of their inception. So whenever we're talking about what it means to be human, we see a lot of the same ideas discussed, be it in anthropology, sociology, literature, history, or psychology. It all relates back to just, what it means to be human. So psychology, it is a scientific study, and it has 4 main goals. And no matter what subfield of psychology you were to look into, you'll find that these goals are pretty consistent. So the goals are to describe, explain, predict, and control behavior. That's kind of what the context of all of those mean there. Alright, and so like I said, so psychology really didn't become a scientific field until about the 19th century, kind of about when we start having the age of enlightenment and kind of the scientific revolution. But really philosophy gets its roots in, psychology gets its roots in philosophy, and it's not just Western philosophy, which is largely influenced by the ancient Greeks and then the Romans, but also Eastern philosophy. So things like Buddhism and Hinduism and Confucianism and even Islam and just any other type of belief system or like cultural tradition ideas, like all of those influence the beginning of psychology, and they continue to influence psychology. And so it's interesting to note, so once again, psychology, it's all about trying to explain human behavior and then, predict that behavior and then control that behavior so that, we turn our behavior to more positive, productive ways. So when we start with the ancient Greeks, it's very interesting. So, our main philosophers there, Plato and Aristotle. And so when it came to these ideas of looking into what it means to be human and specifically looking at how we behave, how we act, how we react to outside stimuli, Plato thought that the brain was like the main control center of, all of our behaviors. And then Aristotle, he comes along and he's kind of like, no, he thought that it was more our heart was the center of mental processes. So what we really see there, we see this duality of kind of intellect, rational thought mixed with emotions. And so we see with each of their thoughts that they're on opposite sides of that spectrum there, with Plato thinking that, our behavior was kind of more of that rational, analytical type thing, or that's more how we can explain it. And then Aristotle thought it was more kind of these emotional-based reactions you have. And really, there's a little bit of truth in both of those theories when it comes to our behavior, and we'll explore that a little bit more as we go through this semester and we go throughout class and we start learning about the different theories and all the different theorists. Alright, so as I said, psychology is a scientific study, and so, the main development there with the age of reason and the scientific revolution was the development of the scientific method. So psychology is a stickler for, making sure that it follows those steps of the scientific method. And just right here, I'm kind of going back to my point where I'm just telling you guys about kind of the prologue to psychology there. And so, we take that historical perspective, and really before the scientific revolution, we see that in Western society, this is all the context of what I'm talking about here. We see in Western society, people were largely uneducated, and they really just didn't know a lot about the world around them. They had a few writings to help them. They had things like, the Bible, and they had, Greek histories and kind of some of their mythologies. And then they had things like diaries. We are just beginning to see the beginning of actual writings, and it kind of starts with diaries there and then moves up to novels. So, we see kind of limited information about the world around us and just about us as human beings too. And so what we see with the scientific revolution is, like I said, we see kind of the beginning of all these different branches of the social science fields, and we also see how they all influenced each other so that they were able to branch out and create their own enlightening field. So basically, the more we found out about archaeology, looking into ancient sites, the more we learned about geology and kind of the formation of the earth, and just certain things like, I have biblical archaeology, I have Egyptology there. And the more we learned about our past as being humans and about different cultures, it just created, more of a well of, or a pool of information on describing human behavior that we were able to draw from to help us be able to, accomplish those 4 goals of psychology a little bit more efficiently. So even though we have those 4 goals that are all in context of how we want people to behave, really the number 1 goal of psychology is to cause no harm. Psychology is about what it means to be human, and when you actually get out into the real world field of psychology, it's really about helping people, and it's about helping people in the context of encouraging all of us to reach to become those higher versions of ourselves and to self-actualize, be that positive example of change, and then help encourage others to do that too. Because as human beings, we are social creatures. And we do need each other to survive. We would not be where we are at in life and in society today if we hadn't have worked with each other for so many years. So, alright, just a little bit more here about what I'm saying about how, all these early discoveries at the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment were really, just changing information, or just changing information, on what we knew, not only about the greater outside natural world and the universe, but we are also finding out more about what it means to be human. Alright, and so just continuing on and giving you guys a little bit more background history here, so I'll give you guys a few minutes to kind of read over that slide, but basically, like I said, the more of these discoveries we had, the more questions then we had about what it means to be human, and in order for psychology to be able to focus in on those questions and look at how that affects how we think, how we behave, how we engage others, why we have things like mental diseases and abnormal behavior. And in order for psychology to find a good way to go about answering those questions, that's where the scientific method comes in. So the scientific method is kind of you can look at it as a formula of how to go about answering and asking questions. And then it's just a way to help make our data that we come up with more valid and more credible. And so the scientific method, it's not unique to psychology. It's actually a process that all researchers and scientists use to help ask and answer questions. And really, in many ways, we apply the scientific method to kind of our daily lives. That's just, once again, part of being human means that we are also problem-solving creatures and task-oriented creatures, and the way that we go about, finding the most optimal way to complete tasks or to solve problems is by asking questions. We have to, ask questions. We have to come up with different ideas on how we're going to go about approaching that topic, solving that problem, answering those questions, and then we have to kind of, do that background research and able to make us form the best conclusion that we can based on that question, if that makes sense, you guys. Alright, so these are basically the 5 steps to the scientific process, pretty much like I said. So you start out with asking that question, then I'm going to skip here, then you're going to actually come up with that hypothesis. So your hypothesis, that's your thesis statement, that's your argument. So you come up with the question, and then you take that question and you turn it into a statement. So, what would be, okay, here's a good one. So say you want to write a paper looking at, saying that, hold on, give me a minute, guys, I'll think of one here. So you want to, I'm trying to think of one specifically to psychology. I'm going to come up with, let me just go ahead and give you this example. So say you want to look into more developmental psychology, and you want to do an experiment to see what is causing people to have diabetes. So you come up with a question: what causes people to have diabetes? So then you would do a little bit of background research and kind of get those main points, maybe what you just kind of know from personal experience about diabetes. And so you kind of gather all those points, pull in your academic resources and look and see what they say. And so then you come up with a statement. You say, okay, eating too much sugar causes diabetes. And then you want to get more specific than that. You want to say something like, eating Dairy Queen ice cream 3 times a day, every day, 7 days a week, will give you diabetes. So then that is your thesis. That is what you're going to be writing your paper and arguing on. And so you'll do experiments, and then based on those experiments, you'll analyze that data, and then you'll come up with the conclusion. So you'll either say, yes, eating Dairy Queen 3 times a day, 7 days a week increases your risk of getting diabetes. Or you say, you know what, we're wrong. It doesn't increase your risk of diabetes. And then to really throw a curveball into that, you could say, okay, well, it's not just eating ice cream from Dairy Queen every day that causes diabetes. There are other factors that you have to consider too. So you see, basically what I'm just talking about here with that little example is that, when it comes down to doing your research and really honing in on a topic, you start with that general thing, and then as you do your research, as you do your experimentation and testing, you really focus in and become more specific and in answering that question. And sometimes when you, after you do all of your experiments and analyze your data, you come to the conclusion that you are wrong. And that is called a null hypothesis. And null hypotheses are okay too. Even if you disprove yourself, that's still something that helps us learn a little bit more. Alright, so in psychology, we are looking at, like I said, that mind-body connection, how our thoughts affect how we act and react. And it's not just humans that we study in psychology, but we also study animals and other species. And that's important to know because, we do share the planet with many other species. And our interactions with them dictate a little bit about what it means to be human. And then just some of the way that they behave teaches us a lot about what it means to be human. A good example of that is Jane Goodall. She is she's really one of the first primatologists and kind of female primatologists back in the back in the 60s. She was working with some famous anthropologists over in a place called Ottawa Gorge, and I believe it's over in Kenya. It's somewhere over in Africa. But they discover Ottawa Gorge is a prehistoric site that is not only one of the oldest sites to record human history, but it's also the longest. So we have many different stages of early human development that can be seen at Ottawa Gorge. And the Leakeys are the famous anthropologists that are known for studying that. And now today they started out in the 60s, and now their kids are still working on that. I believe they might even be on to grandkids now. So interesting stuff there. But so Jane Goodall was working with the Leakeys as a young 18-year-old college student, and they just happened to notice that there were always these groups of chimpanzees that were always hanging out by the river down in the gorge. And so Professor Leakey got this idea of like, hey, let's study how they act. If somebody would just, sit down and observe how those chimpanzees are acting, we think that it can really give us insight into how early human beings acted in this area here in Ottawa Gorge. So Jane Goodall, she volunteered for it, and she has, and since then, she just, the ball just kept rolling. I mean, she's taught us a lot about not only chimpanzee behavior, but like I said, a lot about early human history and early human behavior. And that woman is in her early 90s, I believe, right now, and she is still out, very active, out in us, trying to save chimpanzees, trying to save the environment, and in helping just children all over the world. So, very interesting woman. She's one of my favorite researchers who gives me a lot of hope and inspiration, and I encourage you guys to look into her. So, just a little example there of how, we study animals and how that kind of relates to what it means to be human too. And so we know that part of being human also means that we have belief systems, and belief systems don't necessarily just mean religion. Belief systems are very encompassing, and not all cultures have a religion per se, but we all have belief systems, and those belief systems are basically just a way for our societies to teach us how to get along with each other and kind of conform so that, we keep society running smoothly. So we see a little bit of the nature versus nurture debate being presented with these ideas. That's a key part. That's really one of the main debates when it comes down to what does it mean to be human. Does being human mean that we are that our personalities and our behaviors, there's something we're born with, or does it mean that being human, that we are born these blank slates and we have no personalities, we have no thoughts, no behaviors, and society shapes all of us in that. And so it's a big debate we've been having since the ancient Greek philosophers, and as far as I would say we're probably shaped by a little bit of both. But keep that debate in mind in the back of your head, because as we go throughout class this semester, we will kind of refer back to that quite a bit. Alright, and just, I skipped ahead there, but just really quickly wrapping up what I was talking about that prologue of how psychology started. And so now what I want to do is start looking at some of these key philosophers and key psychologists that have influenced the evolution of psychology and just the shaping of the field in general. Alright, so what we want to do, so we got that kind of early prehistory stuff out of the way, and so now we're going to kind of jump to the 1600s. This is really the beginning of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. So what we see, we've just got a few people to note here. Johannes Kepler, he was one of the first kind of astronomers, the first person to, kind of study the sky. He actually invented the telescope, and then, that's what led Galileo and all those other cats to finding out everything that they knew about the universe. And why it's important that we include him in psychology is because of his invention of the telescope. When Kepler created the telescope, that helped lead us to more studies about optics, about our vision and how we see, and it led to us learning that, the way our eyes work and how, when we bring information in, it's actually reversed of how we really see it, but the light bounces in and then our retinas and all the nerves in the back of our eyes, they kind of reverse it and point it out so that we see the world around us the way that we do. And that's really important because we know that our perceptions play a big role in how we behave. There's actually a whole subfield of psychology that's just devoted specifically to looking at the perception and stuff. So Kepler was really instrumental in getting the ball rolling for that knowledge. And then when it comes to Francis Bacon, he was actually a genuine Renaissance man. He did a little bit of everything. He was over here in the colonies in America advocating for their, departure from Britain. He was over in Britain doing political things. He was writing in literature. He was, really instrumental in and helping all these other guys at the time, redefine their ideas and kind of take their ideas and get them put out into the public, and instrumental in making a lot of social changes. And the main thing to note with psychology with Bacon is that he was one of the first main advocates for the use of the scientific method. And then next we have Descartes, and Descartes we consider the father of modern Western philosophy, and he was really influential in psychology because he was the first one who came up with that mind-body connection and those ideas of, how we think affect how we react. And we see, that is a little bit different from the Greek philosophers, what we just saw there with Plato and Aristotle was one just saying it's all our brain and the other one saying it's all our heart there. So, Descartes put that together and said, no, it's kind of a little bit of both there. And so, interestingly, Descartes also kind of start challenging some of our ideas of just what is consciousness, and that's something that we'll talk about throughout class and kind of devote a whole class lecture on looking into. So basically, Descartes thought that just reality, the universe, that there was just this natural, intricate, innate logical structure that made up the universe. I guess a way to make that make more sense to everybody is what he's talking about is there is some kind of outside intelligence or higher intelligence that creates up the whole universe. And us, as being intelligent, conscious beings, we naturally pick up on kind of those logical, that innate logical structure of life. And so then that affects how we think, how we behave, and then just how we go about experiencing life. And Descartes was also one of the first guys to really emphasize this idea that life was more than just our sensory perceptions. That was a really big thing with Aristotle. His view of consciousness and reality was only based on our five senses. It was only what we could see, touch, hear, taste, or smell. And any other experiences you had outside of those, in Aristotle's mind, they weren't real. It wasn't a part of reality. And when you get into abnormal psychology, if you take that or if you've already taken that, you'll know a little bit more about how that influenced what the Greeks thought about abnormal behavior. But what I just want to point out with that is that, we do know that life, consciousness, reality, it is made up of more things than just our five senses alone. And there are actually whole subfields of psychology that are devoted to specifically those ideas. And then next we have John Locke, and John Locke is another kind of early philosopher, and he is really important because he really is one of the main guys who started this nature versus nurture debate. And he started it out in response to Descartes, but really it's the work between him and Thomas Hobbes that really show each sides of those debates. So Locke believed that we were born these tabula rasa is what he called it, and it pretty just much means a blank slate. So inherently, Locke argued that as human beings we're good by nature because we're born these blank slates, and it's society then that causes us to kind of maybe go more into those negative behavioral patterns. And so Hobbes was on the other side, and he said, no, by nature, human beings, we're bad, we're greedy, we're selfish, and we see that reflected in how society is made up. And, like I said, this argument was really foundational in paving the way for psychology to come along and really start studying human behavior. And like I said, it's a debate that even to this day we still kind of go round and round in psychology with. And then, interestingly, so like I said, so the beginning of psychology, it was really an amalgamation of, looking at all these different cultural beliefs, all these different cultural philosophies, and kind of, shaping those into something new, which would be the field of psychology, right? And so, we hear a lot about the Age of Enlightenment, the beginning of the scientific revolution, and there's this debate between kind of science and religion, or just, science and belief systems in general. And when we really get into the history and kind of get into the biography of these early psychologists and these early philosophers, we see that they were very well-traveled and very educated people, meaning that, they did go out and spend time in other cultures and learn about other cultural ways, their philosophies, their belief systems. And so, they use that as tools in their tool belt to help going about explaining human behavior. And so when they got back to start writing their papers and their books and teaching about psychology, they were including all those different ideas in that. And we really see that with our father of American psychology, and that is William James. He really especially used a lot of Eastern philosophies, Buddhism specifically, in a lot of his writings, and just kind of how he viewed consciousness and just the way that as human beings we engage with the world around us. Alright, so that kind of gives us that really wraps up our background of psychology. So now we are at the point in time to where psychology is established itself as a scientific field. And that started in Germany in about 1879 with Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt is important because he was the first person who actually started a psychology lab, doing experiments and actually teaching students how to go about conducting archaeology in a scientific way. So Wundt actually, when we break down the historical overview of psychology, we see it occurs in different waves, are kind of what we can call schools of thought. So our first one here with Wundt is structuralism. And the main thing about Wundt here is that he came up with this idea called objective introspective, and basically what it's really about examining and measuring one's own thoughts and mental processes. So it would just be something like he would have a student pick up a rock and then just feel the rock. How does it feel in your hand? And things like that. And so that's kind of how it started. And so it was really based on kind of a behavioral, just looking at how you react to stuff in the outside stimulus. And then Titchener comes along, and he was a student of Wundt, and he took that I forget what it is, objective introspective, and he added the mind connection to it. So, when the student would hold that rock in their hand, not only, were they going to respond to the physical reactions of it, but Titchener took it that step further to say, now think about how does it make you feel, as in, in your mind, not just is it hot, is it warm in your hand, is it cold in your hand, is it rough, smooth, but actually, feeling that rock is warm in your hand. What thoughts and emotions does that bring up into your head? So we see that's important because we see, once again, that mind-body connection there, and it helped us just understand a little bit more about just the basic structure of our minds and how we go about thinking. And we know that it's based on our experience, it's based on our emotions, and then that is ultimately what forms the thoughts that we had. Alright, and so interestingly, so that's Titchener, and one thing else I want to note about Titchener here is that he actually started in Germany there with Wundt, but he was the first one to bring structuralism over to the Americas, and what made that pretty awesome was not only, these ideas he had about the mind and how the mind works that he came up with, but we start to see some of the first women in psychology emerging. And so Titchener had Margaret Washburn. She was one of his first graduate students. She was the first woman to receive a PhD in psychology from Harvard. That was in 1894, and Washburn, she went on to do some really other kind of really cool and interesting things that just help evolve the face of psychology into what it is today. So she was really instrumental in laying some of the foundational groundwork in what we know. And so basically structuralism was kind of short-lived. I guess that's kind of for all schools of thought. They kind of go in these kind of periods, and so that was the hot thing there for like the 19th century, and then early into the 1900s, so about the beginning of the 20th century, society's changing, people are changing, and therefore the way we think is changing, so psychology starts changing too. And so we see the next wave of thought that comes in, and that is functionalism. And functionalism is really about how that mind-body connection makes us adapt and makes us survive, and then ultimately how that makes us who we are as human beings. And so functionalism started coming about right when Darwin came out with the Origin of Species, and we see a lot of other social things going on at this time. We see the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We see the beginning of mass society. We see these ideas of eugenics. We see classism start to be formed. We see immigration on the rise. And so all these ideas of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, these ideas of just evolution in general really influenced functionalism. So like I said, so it's like, why do we have arms and hands? How did that happen? Why do we need those? How does what we're thinking in our head relate to how we just, function normally in society? And so there's actually functionalism, I would say, would be the beginning of the subfield called evolutionary psychology, which really looks a lot at these Darwinian ideas too. So interesting stuff going on there. So alright, like I've already told you guys, William James is considered the father of American, or modern American philosophy, we should say. And he is one of my favorite historical a psychologist, and it's just because, once again, he was a very well-traveled, well-educated man. He was one of the first to really look at these ideas of not just the mind-body connection, but also look at the human nature connection. So with a lot of psychology and looking at the context of how we behave, a lot of it in the early days and even today, it's more on that social side of how we engage others. But then there's a whole nother side too that actually looks at how the natural world influences our thoughts and our behaviors and engagements with others too. So William James was kind of one of the first guys to come along with that. He was also, if you guys remember anything about literature, he was also kind of a part of the Transcendentalists, people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Louisa May Alcott, and her dad, I can't remember his name, but another Alcott, Robert Louis, no, not him, Washington Irving, who wrote Sleepy Hollow. He is actually kind of a transcendentalist too, but all of those guys were kind of some of the first environmental activists, because they were all around at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and they were kind of seeing some of the ways that nature was being damaged by industry, and so they were really focused on looking at how that natural environments influenced who we are as humans. And because of that, we actually have fields in psychology, eco-psychology, and transpersonal psychology, and we'll talk a little more about those as we go through class too. So as I have given you a little bit of overview of James here, hopefully you've had time to read the points on the slide. The only thing I want to point out here is that his book Principles of Psychology, even though it was written back in the late 1800s, it's really still considered one of the best written texts on psychology, and it's a source for many original ideas. And what we mean by that, by saying it's a source for many original ideas, is that that's what makes James so cool, is that you can go in and read his stuff, and it kind of sparks a little bit of different imagination and kind of ways of thinking in each of us, so that we're able to take his ideas and then kind of be creative and critical and turn those into our own. And so, not only is James important because he's the father of modern American psychology, but his ideas on just how consciousness works, how our mind works, are really instrumental. And so James thought that consciousness works as a stream. He stressed the importance of habit and instinct. That's a part of the mind-body connection too. As humans, some of our behaviors are very habitual or ritualistic, and then at the same time, we have those basic primal instincts, kind of those flight or fight mechanisms, or those experiences that trigger our amygdala, which is kind of that's our most raw primal part of our brain that directly relates to kind of like our fear response and how we go about handling that. And so James also came up with some really complex and interesting ideas just on the self and on emotion. And then he really opened up psychology to include things like religion and belief systems. So he was really bringing in other cultural perspectives, and that was kind of innovational for his time period. Alright, and so once functionalism had its little spot in the spotlight there, and then it started to die out, we kind of see, I would say that we see psychology regress a little bit, because our third school of thought that comes along is behaviorism. And behaviorism, what sets it apart from any other theories in psychology is that it does not acknowledge the mind-body connection. We're kind of going back to the early days of structuralism in a sense, because we're not looking at, what you think or what caused you in your head to respond a certain way to that outside stimulus. It's all about how you're responding to that outside stimulus. And so one of the first main psychologists, you may actually, this may be familiar to you, but I can't say his name, Ivan Pavlov. He is one of the first behavioralists. He did this study with dogs. So Ivan Pavlov, he did the study to where if you rang the bell, it would make the dog salivate. Actually, we will watch a video on that. I don't think I have it in this lecture, but we will watch a video on that later on in class. And so basically, what we learned a lot from behaviorism is just this idea of fears, really. The ideas of fears and phobias, and just, how those are learned and how we experience those. So once again, it's all about observable behavior. So we can say it's how we respond to outside or environmental stimuli. Alright guys, and so next, this is actually, we'll talk about him in class. This right here is Dr. Zimbardo. He did a really famous experiment back in the 1970s called the Stanford Prison Experiment that is really a radical look into human behavior and just ideas of morality and how kind of power tends to corrupt people. We'll definitely look more into that, but I just want to point him out because we'll watch a lot of these discovering psychology videos throughout class, and Zimbardo is the one that hosts them, so we'll see him a lot, and he's kind of an interesting fellow there. So I'm leaving it up to you guys to, on your own, I may have to put the links up. I'm not sure if you guys will be able to watch this way, but I'll get all these links up for you guys so that you can go watch these videos. Make sure that you do watch them. It is important to help give the foundation to these different theories, because we'll always draw back to these different theories throughout class in the context of whatever topic we're talking about. So make sure you watch the videos. I will get the links up for you. Alright, so basically Pablo figured out that we had these automatic responses to stuff. So that's what his whole little experiment with ringing the bell to make the dog salivate. When dogs know that they're going to be presented with food, they naturally salivate. That is their kind of automatic response. If something scares us, our automatic response is, to jump, maybe our heart starts palpitating, we get, sweaty, kind of shortness of breath, it's kind of all those just those reactions that our autonomic nervous system does that we really don't have a lot of control over in many ways. And, they're just kind of these natural responses we have to outside stuff. And so what Pablo figured out is that he could get those dogs to have that natural response to a different stimuli. So he, went through and did the steps and taught them to respond, and taught him to salivate when a bell rang, because it's really it's building an association is what's going on here. And this is actually called classical conditioning, which we'll look into later on in class, and we'll do some fun little examples on that. But it's making a connection. It's like, okay, so this stimulus is going to create this response. So presenting food creates salivating. Let's change that. Ringing the bell creates that salivating. So the reason that is important to know, those natural kind of automatic responses we have is because this is a way to help treat phobias, to help us overcome maybe anxiety and fears. And it's all about conditioning, classical conditioning. It's all about conditioning us to respond, to naturally respond another way. And so based on Pavlov's experiments there, we have John B. Watson come along, and he did a really famous experiment with little Albert. Yeah, little Albert, where he taught him to be afraid of a white rat. And then they just conditioned him to be pretty much afraid of every kind of white, fuzzy thing that little boy was presented with. So a really controversial study and experiment there, because not only were they using a baby, but they conditioned this fear response into it, and, just caused a lot of chaos and disapproval in the world of psychology. And Watson actually got out of psychology and went into the field of advertisement, and that's interesting to note too, because a lot of the way society commercializes to us and advertises to us is extremely psychological. So we see that psychology influences our lives and just our everyday lives too, in many ways that we might not be aware of it. So even though Watson did this kind of controversial experiment, it taught us a lot about phobias. It taught us that phobias are not innate. We're not naturally born with those, but it's something we're actually conditioned to have inside of us. We can actually argue that with evolutionary psychology, but that's for another class. Just want to point out here, so Watson did that, and he had another female psychologist help him out, and that was, I can't remember her first name, Susan maybe, Rayner. And then later on we have Jones, and maybe that was Susan. I can't remember which one of them is Susan, but she comes along and she redoes Watson's experiment with little Peter. And what she did, so she took little Peter and she created a phobia in him, and then what she showed, which Watson didn't show, that you could train that phobia back out. So she taught little Peter to be afraid of a white rabbit, I believe. And then once she had him afraid and had that phobia of being being afraid of any white fuzzy thing, and then she went back and she counter-conditioned that. So she kind of reversed the process to take that away and make him not scared of that specific stimuli. So pretty interesting and cool stuff there. Make sure you watch this video. I believe this is actually the video that talks about Watson. That's it. I think that first one with Zimbardo is the one talking about Pablo and the dogs. And then this one is the one that tells you about Watson there. So interesting stuff there. So, alright, so now we go and, so behaviorism has its time in the spotlight, and then we move on to psychoanalysis, which is the fourth school of thought or wave of psychology. And psychoanalysis was extremely instrumental in setting up modern day society. When it first came out in the 19th century, I mean, it was revolutionary. revolutionary, and like I said, it really changed the whole face of society and kind of the world overall. So that's kind of the, so Freud and psychoanalysis is in everything, and the more you learn about Freud, the more you're able to kind of pick it up in everything that you kind of see and read in society. So with Freud, basically what we do is we go back to saying, okay, being human is more than just those observable behaviors. We've got to go back and put the mind part back into it. And so for Freud, just real quickly here, he broke our mind up into 3 different parts: the conscious mind, the subconscious, and the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind, Freud believed, was the biggest part of our mind, our behavior, and so that is where most of our behavior lied, was in that unconscious mind. And and so a lot of the way that we behave in society, especially when it comes to those abnormal behaviors that we present, it has a lot to do with kind of these kind of repressed ideas, kind of some repressed instincts that we have that all lay in our unconscious mind. Freud thought that in our early childhood experiences really shaped how we behave as an adult. So Freud thought that ultimately as human beings we were our libido, which is kind of our life force, is kind of the main thing dictating our behavior. And he focused a lot on 2 main principles: the pleasure principle and the reality principle. And basically with the pleasure principle, we're looking at our eros and our thanatos, okay? So Freud basically thought that all of our behavior is based on our eros and our thanatos, and those are our sex drive and our aggression drive, respectively. Another way we could say those is they're our life drive and our death drive. And when it comes down to it, sex and aggression, those are our 2 most primal instincts and primal behaviors. Those are kind of the things that we need to survive. But we can't run around mating with everybody and killing everybody, right? It doesn't work that way. So that's then when society comes along, and it kind of sets up these guidelines for us to go about controlling our eros and our thanatos. And so that's then when Freud steps in and says, it's kind of that society kind of telling us how to control our pleasure principle and kind of forcing us to maybe go against that. That's what causes abnormal behavior and mental illness and things like neuroses in society. So just a quick little overview of Freud. We will definitely talk more about him throughout class. The next video I'm going to have you guys watch is a short little video on psychoanalysis, and it's very possible that we'll refresh ourselves and watch that video later on in class. I love the video. It's a really, really great overview. So Freud really gave us a lot of insight into how to provide therapy for things like fear and anxiety. When the number one reasons that people go to seek some type of psychological therapy or treatment is for depression and anxiety, and most of the time it's some kind of underlying fear that is the etiology or root cause of that anxiety or that depression. So psychoanalysis is, has really been strong as far as therapeutic techniques and practices go. Even still to today, even though we have we're a little bit more holistic now, and we kind of combine a bunch of the different theories and treatment and therapy options. Freud always seems to creep back in there at some point or another. So lastly, Freud created this idea of deep listening, and it's basically just the idea that as human beings, one of the best ways we go about working out our problems and working out the things that are bothering or troubling us is just by talking it out. And so talk therapy is kind of what Freud started, and this idea of deep listening is the opposite side of that. So you want your patient or your client to come in and kind of just talk, and just from them talking, they're going to kind of figure out what it is, the source of what is bothering them. And then your job as the psychologist is to listen. And we say deep listening because it's a different type of listening. Most of the times as human beings, when we go to engage in conversations with each other, we always like to think we're right and that we know everything, and we don't really hear what the other person is saying to us. We pick up on the general gist of what somebody is talking about, and then our brains automatically go to how we want to respond. So we're not really listening. We're like, oh, you're talking about trees? Well, everything I know about trees you're thinking about, and you're like, oh, shut up so I can tell you everything that I know about trees. We kind of naturally do that as human beings. And so that's where Freud was instrumental in saying, okay, so when these patients come in and they start talking out their problems, our job as the therapist is not be like, no, wait a minute, let me tell you what I know about that, and interrupt them. Your job is to sit there and truly just, clear your mind and listen to what they're saying, because that's a way for you to get more insight, and it's a way to create that newness, because, even though we like to always think we're right as human beings, we're not always right. And that's okay, because that's part of being human beings too. We have to be wrong and we have to make mistakes in order to, grow and evolve and develop into more of our self-actualized selves, or higher versions of ourselves, like the humanists talk about, which we'll find out later on in class 2. So once again, that's just a little good video on Freud, so make sure you guys go and read that. So, okay, so those are our first 4 ways of psychology, and right now we're kind of struggling with what we think is going to be the 5th wave, or the 5th school of thought. There are a lot of different branches of psychology kind of vying for that title. 2 of the main ones, though, are multicultural psychology and positive psychology. Multicultural psychology, really took off in the 1980s, and it's just all about taking a more holistic overview of that mind-body connection, realizing that people, different cultures teach us different ways to think and behave, and that when it comes to helping people in society, we have to be aware of those cultural differences, because in the past we've taken those cultural differences and we've looked at them as being abnormal behaviors. And so, if somebody was from a different culture, practiced a different religion, and then came to America, went to go get some kind of psychological help, more than not, they were termed as being crazy and possibly even locked up. And so it's really important that we understand that just because a culture does something that we think is kind of weird in our culture, it doesn't mean that it necessarily is. A good example would be like scarification or tattooing. Our ideas of beauty, all of those vary with cultures, and we can't really say one is right or one is more wrong. And our job as psychologists is not to pass those kinds of judgments. Our job is to help and to gain that deeper understanding of human behavior. So we have to take those individual and cultural contexts into perspective. So basically what that does then is it has set us up in psychology to have more of this holistic perspective. So we're looking at everything overall that we can think of that makes us human and that affects how we think, how we behave, how we engage others. Okay, so then that brings us to Gestalt psychology. I point this one out because this is really when we with Gestalt psychology, it really is about stepping back and looking at the overall structure and organization. So Gestalt actually means the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's taking that overall view. It was created by Max Wertheimer there, and so, it was largely against structuralism, but like I said, the main reason why I focus in on it for a minute is just to get that idea in our head of, that even in the early days of psychology, we're seeing this kind of this these perspectives of being more holistic in the way we go about trying to understand and engage human thought and behavior. Okay? So, alright, so like I said, modern day, we have multicultural psychology, we have positive psychology, we have paranormal psychology, linguistic psychology, cognitive psychology, integral psychology, and just cultural psychology. Just about anything that you can think of that deals with being human or being culture, there is a subfield of psychology that looks into that. So, say if we just want to look specifically into sexuality, there's a psychology of sexuality, psychology of belief systems, just like I said, psychology of anything you can think about. So like I said, no matter what subfields we have today, psychology kind of circles around. It's a very dynamic field that is always growing, but it kind of always circles back in on itself too, and always comes back to, these older ways of thought, because we're basically going back in and we're redeveloping those, finding new ways to look at, those older perspectives, and then changing those into something new there. So, like I said, psychoanalysis has been very instrumental in shaping psychology, and psychoanalysis, once it's kind of started dying out, people just thought that Freud, he really just emphasizes these, the sexual urges too much, and just those types of things, and some of his ideas, some people really didn't agree with. Well, once again, go more into that as we go through class. But basically what I'm trying to tell you guys is that, because of some of the criticism of Freud's original ideas, we see some of his students come along and they turn psychoanalysis into kind of psychodynamic perspective. And once again, it's basically everything that Freud's talking about, but in a way they kind of take a more positive look on human behavior. And like I said, they don't necessarily look into all that kind of pin-up sexual aggression that Freud said a lot of us suffered from. They kind of go away from that and say, well, no, life is, those are key points of what it means to being human and just living in general, but, there's a lot more that makes up our behaviors. Alright, and then, with early behaviorism there, with Pavlov and Watson, we had what I called was classical conditioning, and then kind of in the 20th century, behaviorism even kind of changed a little bit. Now, it didn't change in the fact that it didn't acknowledge the mind-body connection. It's still focused mainly, it's solely on our physical reaction to outside stimulus, but we kind of change some of the dynamics of it, and so we come up with operant conditioning. And the main difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning is the response. Remember what I just said? With classical, it's automatic. It's kind of something that we don't have control over, whereas with operant conditioning, it's all very much a part of our immediate consciousness and how we are going to behave, just based on our just responses in general, and like I said, not those automatic ones. So it's a system of rewards and punishment. So we're really looking at how individuals respond to something and taking in the consequences of those responses. And that's really a main key to how we learn in life. If you go back and you think way back to elementary school, teachers use a type of operant conditioning and just say things like token economies, or like giving you stickers. Say if you behave that, you were good all day in kindergarten, did everything your teacher wanted, you get a nice big sticker for the day, and your 5-year-old self was so proud to have that sticker, right? So then that encouraged you to keep behaving in an appropriate way because you wanted to get those stickers. And then maybe if you got so many stickers, then your teacher upped the ante and say, okay, little Billy, you get 5 stickers in a week, and then at the end of the week, you get to go over here and pick from the toy bucket and get whatever toy or piece of candy out of that you want. So you see, that's a way of conditioning us, and it's not we have the choice to say, well, do I want to keep acting this way so that I can get that toy or get that piece of candy, or do I want to decide to not because I don't care about that toy or candy? So you see how that's different to where the dogs didn't have a choice in saying, I'm not going to salivate to that bell. They had no choice, they had to do it. But with operant conditioning, it's more of researchy choice, as in our participant choice there. So interesting stuff there. This is just a quick little overview. The main advocate of operant conditioning is B.F. Skinner, and there's somebody else that came up with it before Skinner. I can't remember who his name is, but we'll talk about him later on in class too. Hopefully by then I'll think of the other guy. I can't think of it right now. So make sure you watch that video too. Alright, so then that leads us to the humanistic perspective. And then once again, in a way, this, like I said, how this fifth school of thought in psychology is all kind of jumbled up right now. In a way, we kind of view humanism as being the next main body of thought in psychology. It came about the 50s and the 60s, but this is really at the time we see, that resurgence in behaviorism and those ideas with Skinner. And so, we also see that with the changing of psychoanalysis into psychodynamics. So what we see is really, before the humanists came along, a lot of what we focused on and looking at just human behavior tended to be more on the negative side, looking more into those abnormal behaviors, looking more into dysfunctional behavior in many ways. And the humanists are kind of one of the first ones to come about and actually change that. Actually, I would say William James did a little bit of that too with functionalism, but with the humanists, they really brought it into perspective and brought in these ideas that when it comes to helping people to become the best versions of themselves as possible, that we had to take the whole person into account. And so that goes beyond just that mind-body connection, and we see that our beliefs being added in, our emotional intelligence then really starts getting added in to try to explain our behavior. And then, like I said, the humanists, Maslow and Rogers are two of the main, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. They really emphasize more kind of these positive aspects and ideas of human behavior. And that's kind of what led to what we have right now, the subfield of positive psychology, which is really a very dominant force in the field of psychology right now. And Martin Seligman is the psychologist that is associated with starting positive psychology. There's some really great talks by him on YouTube if you would want to go and check some of that out. Alright, and so then, along then with the humanistic approach, like I said, so we'll start really opening up psychology to look at that holistic view of human behavior, and so that's when we really start seeing all these different branches and subfields start coming out. So just a few of those there. Some of these I've already talked about. Oh yeah, see there's even social-cultural psychology. We have that biopsychological psychology, genetic psychology, or just genetics in general has a lot to do with the foundation of psychology. And so just basically what it comes down to is all of these different subfields, these different branches of psychology. It's all about, like I said, with the scientific method. In order to get the most data to come up with that best thesis, that best conclusion, you really want to, start with that general, broad issue, question, and then you want to work it down into something more specific. And so that's just what we see with these different branches here, is that everybody's just kind of focusing in on that one specific thing, because it's a lot easier to tackle a subject when you can get into that specificity of it, rather than, doing that general overview. That's really how you develop your critical and your creative skills, and how, if you were to go into psychology, you can impart a little bit of your own ideologies into the field. And that's something we definitely see throughout psychology, which each new wave of thought, each new main theorist that comes about, there's something that we can credit to them. And it's kind of funny too, because with each of those guys, a lot of times we end up getting these different words for the same things, because everybody had to have their own way of saying it. A good one would be consciousness, cognition, mental processes, the mind, the brain. I mean, when it comes down to it, those are all different terms, but they all mean the same thing. We're all talking about the stuff that goes on inside our heads, but everybody has their own way of saying it. And then we have Freud, and more specifically Jung, coming along, and then we see this idea of the psyche coming up, and the psyche is referring to our brain too, and it's more the personality part of our brain. So don't get confused if you see these words get interchanged, and some of these words, like I said, they're just different ways of saying the same thing there. Alright, so now that we have gone through our introduction and our history of psychology, I want to go back and just think about how psychology can apply to our everyday life. And it really comes back to what I'm talking about, our critical thinking skills. And so we know our critical thinking, that's how we solve problems, that's how we accomplish tasks, that's how we reason, judgment, make decisions. And that's important for us to have as human beings, because, once again, it's part of being a human being. It's part of how we grow and develop, not only as individuals, but as cultures there. And so, when it comes to our critical thinking, I always like to back that up with creative thinking too. So a lot of the times when we think about creativity, we think about like Kurt Cobain, or maybe Jim Morrison, or like Picasso or Monet, or just, artists. We think of when we think, oh, well, I'm not creative because I can't paint, I can't draw, I can't sew, I can't play a musical instrument. And yes, those are aspects of creativity, but that's not all that creativity means. Creativity just simply means being able to create something new, and we constantly do that with how we go about thinking. Our critical, nothing exists in this world without going through the mental plane first. We have to think of it before it becomes an actuality. We didn't start as humans on this earth and automatically have our houses and our cars and our computers, right, guys? That's something that somebody thought of, and then they created it, right? And so that's something that we can do every day with how we think. That, to me, is the creativity is really where that critical part comes in, because that critical part of thinking, that's your ability to take information, process it, and then turn it around and make it your own, present your own ideas, get more of your own voice out there. It's a very creative process when you go to doing that. And so therefore, being able to keep an open mind, have that holistic perspective, and look at all sides of a topic, of a situation, it's just a good rule of thumb to go about living by, because it really is a thing that they really are ways that help us just learn and grow more as human beings. Alright, so just going back a little bit here to the scientific method, and just kind of thinking about the different ways that psychologists use the scientific method. And, like I said, it's a way to go about solving problems, coming up with more data on what we know about something. Of course, we're looking at human behavior in general in psychology. And so the scientific method is also a way for us to kind of, have our errors and have our biases so that we can just, get the most accurate data possible. And so ways that we go about using the scientific method really just come down to experiments and observations. And so we call those descriptive types of applications of the scientific method. And so basically, as you see here on this slide, a lot of these they're just different ways to go about observing how humans or how animals behave. So that's our first one there, naturalistic observation. And that really is, when it comes to animal behaviors, we go out and do more of that natural, look at animals in their natural environment. And we can do that for people too. And when we do these kind of natural observations or lab or any of these different types of studies or experiments, we always have to think about observer bias and participant bias. We have to know that, as the person doing the observing, we have to be aware of how our own biases and preconceptions might influence that data. And then we have to be aware that, sometimes when we get people participating in a study, they don't act like they're supposed to. So think about it. What do we all do on the holidays? Well, I don't know. Maybe a lot of us actually fight with our family on the holidays, but what is it a lot of? Let's put it that way. Okay, we have company coming to visit. What do? We all put on our best face. We're the best versions of ourselves to entertain our company for those few days. And that's a little bit of a participant bias that we're talking about. We see that a lot in anthropological participant observation studies. A lot of times in the early 17 and 1800s, when these anthropologists would go out into these different cultures, the people would kind of dupe the anthropologists, because they knew that if they answered their questions, they would get some kind of a reward, operant conditioning in play here. So if they knew if they answered the anthropologist questions, they were going to get a chocolate bar. That was the main thing, especially in the 1800s. They would give all the people chocolate for some reason. It was just the hot commodity at the time or something. Or cigarettes, that was another big one. They used to, So in a way, they were kind of bribing them for information. Well, a lot of people in these tribes and these cultures, they got smart on that. They weren't stupid. They figured it out. So they would just go in and tell the anthropologist whatever they thought he or she wanted to know, just so they could get whatever that reward was. So these are all things that we have to be aware of when we go about doing our experiments and doing our observations. All right, and then next on here I have case studies, and we have case studies, and there could be longitudinal studies or I can't remember what it's called. It's like cross-longitudinal studies, something like that too. So basically, a case study is just they're really specific. It's just really looking into one specific individual or maybe one specific group of individuals, and it's just really detailing and observing that specific case. A good case study would be, we're going to watch this video in class, is looking at how children diagnosed with ADHD may later on in life turn into criminals. So it's kind of looking at an association between ADHD and criminal behavior. So in the little documentary we watch, they follow a few certain kids and adults around, and so that's kind of a case study. Now, a longitudinal study is a case study, but it actually occurs over a long period of time. So it could be something like, say, with the example I just gave you, they would observe those ADA kids from the age of 6 to say about the age 18. And though these studies are a little bit rare because of just resources being the main thing that kind of limits those. So a lot of times it's usually within maybe about I would say about a 3 to 5 year period you see a lot of kind of longitudinal case studies. But like I said, there actually are ones that actually span people's actual lifespan. I mean, a lot of what we know about behavior and just genetics and personality comes from twin studies, and some of those were a progression of years of us studying specific individuals, specific set of twins there. Alright, and then next we have our experiment, and it's very important. There are some important ideas here in an experiment that we want to be aware of. So in an experiment, we're looking at these things called variables, and our main variables are the independent variable and the dependent variable. So our dependent variable is what is being measured, but it's the independent variable that is being manipulated. So, okay, we want to conduct a study looking at if temperature affects the height of plants. Okay, so how temperature affects the rate of growth in plants there. So we're changing the temperature and looking at how that affects how the plants are going to grow. So say if it's a lower temperature, maybe the plant's not going to, it's more colder, the plant's not going to grow as high. If it's higher, that plant is going to grow taller. So what is it that we're manipulating there? The temperature, right? That's our independent variable, because regardless if that plant grows or not, that temperature is going to be there. That's what we're changing to see how it affects then our dependent variable, which is the growth of the plant. You see, because the growth of the plant is dependent on what that temperature is. So we'll get more into that. That usually confuses everybody. So we'll make sure that we go more into that when we're in class together and actually do some different examples on playing around with those. Okay? So when it comes to an experiment, there are always, more than likely, there are going to always be two groups that we're looking at. Sometimes we break it up and they'll have more than two groups, but classically an experiment is made up of your experimental group and your control group. And the way we go about assigning participants to each group, most of the time it's very random, and it's very random, so people don't really know which group they're going to go into. And the main thing to note here is this idea of the experimental group and the placebo group, okay? So the control group is your placebo group. Those are the ones that are being tricked so that they can see the effects of whatever it is that we are trying to study. So it would be something like taking a weight loss pill to help you lose weight. Alright, so they would set up their experimental group and they would have their control group. The experimental group would get the actual weight loss drug, alright, and then the control group, they would give them a placebo. They'd give them a sugar pill. But neither group knows if they're getting that sugar pill or they're getting the real actual weight loss drug. So they go on, they take those drugs, come back, and then the researchers will look to see how many people in each group actually really lost weight. And this is the really kind of weird and kind of cool thing about our brains, is that there will be people in that placebo group that do lose weight too, because they have it in their minds. They believe that they are taking a weight loss pill. They believe that that pill they put in their mouth is going to make them lose weight. And it does happen for some people. So pretty cool there. It kind of goes along with kind of the power of suggestion. And we'll do some fun experiments in class once we get to that topic here later on. All right. So like I said, usually they're put into these random groups, and then we just have these other kind of more specific types of experiments here. So if the participants don't know which group they're going into, we call that a single blind study. And so when we want to control that experimental effect or kind of that observer bias, which is kind of what we're talking about there too, then we do this double blind study. And basically what that is not only do the participants not know which group they have been put in, but the experimenter doesn't know either. And that's, like I said, so we don't get any of that observer bias on the experimental part that will kind of skew up that data. Alright, and then next we also have correlations, and with correlations we're also looking at the interaction between variables too. And when it comes to correlations, we have either positive correlations or we have negative correlations. So a good example I use in abnormal psychology is and we would look at the correlation of how many friends one has as opposed to kind of say their mental health, okay? So here's a more simple way to say it. Does having more friends cause somebody to be happier as opposed to say somebody who has no friends? We would correlate that and say that they are less happy in life. And so we would do our correlation, and that would be how we would graph it. We would say, okay, Jenny over here has 10 friends, so on the chart, her friendship level is way up here at the top, and then you would give some kind of questionnaire or something to ask Jenny, all these different kind of questions related to happiness and friendship and kind of her self-esteem. And if she were to score high on that, then we would see that positive correlation because we have that friendship on the high end of the scale, and then we see Jenny's feelings on the high end of the scale up there too. So that's a positive correlation because then what we do is say, okay, well, Jenny has 10 friends and she feels this good about herself. Now let's give her 15 friends. So you see them with 15 friends, Jenny gets happier. You see positive correlation. As one goes up, the other one goes up. And then we could reverse that. And this this is just a hypothetical situation. I'm not saying that more friends lead somebody to be more happy. I'm just trying to show you guys how these, how these correlations work. So the opposite end, so less friends, going to be low on the scale. Lower self-esteem, lower levels of happiness. So if we took Jenny and, she's happy with her 10 friends, we took 2 away, now she only has 8. Maybe her happiness is going to go down. Take 3 more away, now she only has, 5 friends. We see her self-esteem goes down. So that's what we're talking about. As one thing goes up, we're going to see an increase in another thing. And it's important to note, though, that it's just not all this cause and effect relationship there, because it doesn't necessarily mean that those 2 variables are actually going to have anything to do with each other. Okay, so maybe Jenny has 10 friends and she has a really good self-esteem and is really happy. She's scoring really high on our correlation test here. There are these other things, guys, there's these other things called confounding variables that we have to think about when we're doing using the scientific method too. And confounding variables are just anything that we didn't take into account in our research that could somehow affect that data. So specifically, we're saying that Jenny's happiness level and self-esteem is based on the amount of friends that she has. There are going to be other things in Jenny's life that are going to make her happy. Things like just the house she lives in, the city she lives in, the type of job that she has, her relationship with her family, her relationship with her mate. All of those are going to have an effect on it. And so those are those confounding variables. A lot of time, researchers, of course, they do take those confounding variables into account, but then there are just things that come up that you're just like, oh, God, I didn't think about that one too. So we just have to be careful and not think that just because we see those positive and negative correlations that we're actually looking at that cause and effect type relationship. It's just kind of a way to kind of gauge information to give us, that basic understanding of whatever it is we're trying to go about understanding. Okay? Alright guys, so next we have, I just want to talk a little bit about psychological ethics. When you go down to each state and pretty much each country, they all have codes of ethics that their psychologists must follow. And they're all kind of similar, but then at the same time, they're all a little bit different. So some of these codes are going to vary state by state. A lot of states, they have their own set of ethical codes. Here in Tennessee, we do have our own set of ethical codes that we follow. It is you can go to tennessee.gov, type in the Tennessee Board of Psychological Examiners, I think it's what it's called. That's kind of that they're the ones who set up our ethical codes and have the guidelines that we follow through. So alright, so even though we vary state by state or country by country, in America, we do have a main psychological organization that all of those codes default back to. So that is the APA, which is the American Psychological Association. And you might also note that APA is the type of writing style that we have to use in class, and it is the one that the American Psychological Association came up with. So just a little fun fact, if that is fun. So basically, so even though those states are in the United States, we'll stick with the U.S. for this, even though they may vary a little bit, all of their ethical codes of conduct are based on the APA, and they're not going to have something that is radically different from it, because like I said, they all have to go and default back to the APA. At the end of the day, as a psychologist, if you do something unethical, you not only have to answer to your state, but then you have to go up and answer to the whole APA board just overall. So it's just kind of important to know a little bit of those ethical differences, and just to note that we must follow ethical codes of conduct in our dealings with our participants, be that animal or human. And then just when clients come in for therapy, we always want to follow these ethical guidelines. And it's just best practice. And but kind of a little bit on the sad side, it's kind of a way to save your butt too, because if you're not following the ethical codes and someone comes into your office for therapy and they feel like you have given them bad advice or wrong advice, they can sue you. You can lose your license, lose your contract. Lose your clinic that you're practicing at, and pretty much just ruin your whole career. And it takes a lot of education and hard work to get into psychology. So you don't want to get to that point and then do something unethical, and all that hard work just goes down the drain. So it's always important to follow these ethical codes. And what I have, you can go click that link and actually look more into the ethical codes. I would actually, encourage you guys to probably bookmark the APA link there. There are free articles that you can go look at. Free, kind of like little mini course type things that they do. They call it professional development, but even as students, there's some interesting stuff in there for you guys, and just a bunch of just great information on psychology in general. If you find that this class has sparked your interest in psychology, and that might be when you maybe want to veer off into your chosen field into, APA is a great place to go find information there. Okay. Alright, so now I want to just kind of step back for a minute and talk about these ideas of consciousness and reality, and then just think a little bit about diversity and how we engage with each other. And that'll kind of wrap up our lecture for this time. So alright, so like I said, oops, let me get that off there, guys, sorry. It's just not going to go away. Crap. There we go. Alright, so we know with psychology we're really looking at this mind-body connection. So this all these ideas of consciousness and what is consciousness and how that affects our behavior are really instrumental in helping us gain that foundation for just understanding behavior a little bit more. So, like I've already said, so William James came up with this idea that a consciousness is a stream. And really and to summarize on this slide here, the reason that is important is because it helps us understand those different states of mind, those different states of consciousness and experiences of reality that we have. So it really gives us that broader view of reality, and very much goes against Aristotle and his 5 sense view of reality. So it's important that we know all these different states of mind, we can say, because they're all very influential in how we engage and engage each other and how we behave. And so when we're talking about consciousness, just real quickly, different states of the mind, different states of consciousness. We already know from Freud, and you guys watch the video by now, hopefully, that hopefully you paused this and watched those videos before you moved on. But we see, the mind, we have the conscious, subconscious, unconscious, we have our psyche, and then, we have things like normal, everyday waking consciousness. We have daydream states. We have dream states. We have these states of consciousness that we call kind of transpersonal, and kind of these kind of more I guess lack of words, kind of religious experiences, like some of these really profound religious experiences people had. That's kind of a transpersonal state. Things like meditation or mindfulness practices, those actually affect our brain and our brain waves and put us in different states of consciousness. So James was really instrumental in getting just not only psychology, but just the world over, but the greater society, and to understanding more about all the different ways that we view reality, and that we define consciousness there. And then, like I've already said, he was really instrumental in beginning kind of transpersonal psychology too. And so with James, what we see is this is why his textbook is still so pristine in psychology, is because based on his ideas, it really has allowed us to come up with a bunch of different hypotheses and theories that help redefine the field of psychology. Alright, so let's think a little bit about this idea of consciousness as a stream. So pretty much what that means is that all our thoughts, emotions, our perceptions, and just everything that constitutes our sense of self and how we view ourselves and view the world around us all flows around in our head. So the Buddhists have this idea, they call it a monkey mind. A lot of the times, like I've already kind of said, as human beings, we constantly have thoughts running around in our head, right? There's always constantly some little voice nagging at us about something, maybe a song stuck in our head, maybe we're thinking about a conversation we had with somebody, but we're always having 15 million different conversations and voices and ideas going on in our head, right? Well, a lot of the time as humans, all that different chatter going on in our brains, it tends to be more on the negative side. So it tends to be more anxiety, fear, worry about, thinking about things that we really can't have control over. And so Buddhists call that a monkey mind, because they say it's constantly chattering at us. And so by James then coming up with this idea as a stream, it's a way for us to kind of make sense of all that inner noise that we have. So all that inner noise, you could think of it, consciousness, it's this river that's flowing through our brain, and all those little different parts of that monkey mind are like little sticks or little ripples or little stones in that stream that are floating down. And so we know as they float down that stream, they can sink, they can bob up, they can maybe get stuck in a whirlpool and go into circles. Rocks, they kind of get tossed around in the water, and they get reshaped and redefined, and with enough time, rocks can get changed into a different kind of rock. And that's kind of how our thought processes work, okay? And like I said, it just, by William James describing our consciousness this way, it just helped us, really open us up to our potential as human beings and, be able to reach these higher states of consciousness that things like our belief systems and our religions tell us about. There's these ideas of higher states of consciousness really do exist in all religions and belief systems there too. We'll talk about all of that a little bit later on too when we talk more about Maslow and the humanists there. And so what we see then, like I said, is James is kind of the first one to come up with this idea of transpersonal psychology. And with transpersonal psychology, we're looking at bridging that gap between our ordinary experiences and our non-ordinary experiences and how all of those relate to our development. Alright, so with transpersonal psychology, it's like I said, it's total opposite of what Aristotle says. Our perceptions, our definitions, our experiences of realities, our belief systems, they go beyond just that mere 5 sense reality. And no, we can't always explain it, but we know that there is something else that is going on, and that when it comes down to it, our cultures, our societies only really teach us maybe 1 or 2 ways of truly viewing reality in this life that we live in. And really there are multiple ways to go about doing it, and it's important that we have an understanding of those multiple ways to go about reviewing consciousness, going about reviewing reality, because that then in turns, what does it do, you guys? You guessed it. It tells us more about what it means to be human. And, that's important for us to know because it all comes back to this idea of survivability. The more we understand about what it means to be human, the more we can tap into our true social nature and learn to work with each other in more of those positive and productive ways. And once we can truly learn to do that, let's just say as just in our culture, then our growth, our experiences of reality and consciousness, they'll explode into something that, right now we can't even really imagine. But, that's what I'm talking about. It's all about those possibilities of what else there can be, and really just about finding these ways to help people deal with those negative things that come at us in life, because that is part of being human, making mistakes, having negative experiences. But the main gist of that is learning from it. So that's really, the essence of everything we talk about in psychology. It's about learning. I tell this to all my students. If, hopefully in this class you learn a little bit something about psychology, but for the most part, I hope that we can all learn a little bit, something more about ourselves and how we go about being who we are in society. Let me set that up with this disclaimer, though, guys. We won't do anything. We will do exercises and kind of play around with some little fun therapy type things, but none of us are licensed psychologists. There are steps you have to take to be able to get to that state. Not even me. I'm still just working on my PhD, and once I get that done, I probably have another 10 years before you go get that license. There's a lot of process involved to be able to get to the point to where you can actually diagnose somebody. So we'll play around with stuff in class, but we're never seriously getting into diagnoses. So just want to point that out to you guys there. Alright, and so in looking at, these ideas of transpersonal psychology and these ideas of these different experiences of consciousness, this is once again where we take that holistic perspective comes back into play, because we have to look at diversity too. As human beings, we are all unique individuals with special gifts to give to society, and our diversity is the spice of life. The reason we have existed so long on this earth is because of diversity. We need differences. That's ultimately how we develop those critical and creative skills, and learn how to solve problems even better than we've done in the past, right? I hate saying better because but it's just let's say more along those positive, productive lines. I like that a lot better than just better. And but at the same time, like I said, life is not all unicorn and rainbows. As much as diversity is the spice of life, it's also a source of conflict too. And conflict is not a bad thing. How we engage conflict is really what dictates how that is going to escalate. But conflict is a way for us to once again work through issues and solve problems. And we do that a lot better when we're working with each other as opposed to when we're fighting with each other. And the reason is because when we can work through that conflict, work through those feelings that come up, those thoughts that come up for us when we're in those conflictual stages, it's just all about, creating more of those social connections and those mutual connections with others. And that is where we see real positive and productive change coming about. And so that's important to know, because when it comes down to it, as human beings, we don't exist in isolation. We do exist as groups, as societies, as cultures. And in those groups, everybody has to be pulling their weight and doing their part to make it work, right? And when we don't, we get conflict. And then that conflict comes up, and what happens? Hopefully, we learn to work through that conflict, and then that's what puts us closer to those along that path of self-actualization and just developing inside ourselves. And so a lot of times this is actually I'm ending this with just some ideas for us to think about as far as psychology goes, and it's also some of this information relates to us specifically in our class. When we get together in our class time, that is our safe space for us to learn and share together. And we're always going to do that with compassion, respect, and understanding. And I really encourage everybody to share in class. That's what makes these types of classes and these topics way more interesting, when we're all bouncing those ideas off of each other. And you guys will find that once we get into class, we're going to have a lot of fun. These 10 weeks are going to fly by quickly, and at the end we're all going to be sad to go, because we're all going to be bestest buddies by that time. I'm telling you guys, it happens that way. And so we do have a lot of fun in these classes, and once again, I really encourage engagement in class. Actually, if any of you are shy, I will cure that in my classes. I do not allow people to be shy. Everybody has to participate at one point in time or another. And like I said, it's all done in a very fun and relaxed way, so there's never any pressure, guys. And just to emphasize again, anything you guys would ever need in class, reach out to me, okay? So when it comes to diversity and these ideas of conflict, we want to look at just how we go about creating our groups and how we communicate with others. So we bring in these ideas of counsel and community. We can create counsel and community anywhere we go, because it's just about working with other people and doing that in those positive and productive ways, so that we have those strong support systems. We have that sense of togetherness, and it just helps to make those positive changes, not only in society but also in ourselves too, okay? And like I said, so really it's the way that we go about handling conflict, which really dictates how that conflict is going to escalate. It really dictates how we're going to learn from that and learn and develop from that conflict. And then, of course, it affects our communication with others. So when we get down into it, and we're all guilty of doing this, you guys, that's one thing to remember too, is that we're all works of process, and we don't always get it right, and that's okay. We've got it, as long as we keep trying and keep trying to learn. Some of these things come a little more easier, some of them not, but it's always okay. If we really want to see true positive change in society, we have to start with ourselves, as Muhammad Gandhi said. So really, it's how we engage in that conflict. And so I just have some ideas here by Pema Chandra. She's a pretty interesting woman. She's like, typically with the Buddhist monks, they are not, women have ever been allowed to become a Buddhist monk, but here about the last, oh goodness guys, 20, 30 years, we have seen a rise in that. So Pema Chandra is kind of one of the first Buddhist monks. She's got a lot of great kind of self-help books, and they're all kind of like that thick, but even though they're really kind of small books, they are loaded with lots of good information. So just to point that out there if you ever want to check her out. And so what she says is that, you know, when we go automatically to red and we're right there screaming and yelling, you know, when conflict comes up, you know, we're really rigid and stagnant, and we're engaging in kind of worn out modes of being. You know, we know that those ways of reacting to conflicts, they don't serve us. They don't do a lot to make or you know, to help improve our lives. They kind of, you know, pull us back down into that negative spectrum. And so once again, we have to change how we engage that. And so for Pema Chandra, it's all about softening our hearts. And you know, that really goes into ego. Like I said, as humans, we like to always think we're right about everything, and we have all the right answers, and a lot of times that's our egos talking. And you know, when we learn to kind of step down from that and come more into a place of humility and willingness to learn, you know, we can take that conflict and change it around in another way. Oh, let me point this out. And, you know, just because we can change how we can engage that conflict, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're always going to change how other people engage in that conflict. And that's kind of a key to remember too, that, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, we can only change ourselves and use that as the example for others. We cannot change others, but we can plant that seed. And so we should always try to plant the seed, whether we even see the fruit of that seed grow or not. We still plant it, and then we just do the best we can, guys, and wish the best for that other person, right? And so that's just kind of how we handle conflict. And so you know, the way we learn to handle conflict better goes into how we can create, you know, better communities, better, you know, working with each other. And so that's kind of where this idea of counsel comes in. And basically, counsel is just the way we go about communicating with each other. And it really is, it's kind of a contemplative process too. So it's all about, you know, there are four intentions of counsel. And counsel is, it came, like I said here, it's mostly associated with Native American culture, specifically the Pacific Northwestern cultures. And so whenever it came down to making any kind of decision, the whole group sits down and everybody gets a say. All right, so whatever that group was going to do to impact their society, the members of their society, and even the natural world around them, they would hold kind of these counseling sections, which is just these big kind of just group discourses. Is where, you know, they would sit in a circle and everybody gets to kind of comment and share their ideas about whatever this thing is that they're going to do. They would have people who would represent, say, maybe like the trees or like the water, so that, you know, they really get that holistic view of looking at the consequences of their actions. So that's kind of what we're talking about with counsel. And then, like I said, it really goes back to how we engage each other. You know, that's why they would set somebody up to represent, say, the trees or the sky or the water or the animals too, because, you know, we're looking at that holistic connection, and then we're just looking at, you know, how we go about engaging in life and being aware of the consequences of our actions. And a lot of times when we engage in that straight to red kind of conflict, we don't really care about the consequences of our actions, and sometimes that can be very detrimental, right? So it's always important that we're aware of not only our, you know, how we respond to things, but kind of keeping that open mind of how everything else is too. So when it comes to counsel, or how we communicate with others, we always want to try to speak from our heart. And it just, when you can speak from a place of honesty with others, that really helps create those feelings of trust and community among your group. The second is listening from your heart. That goes right along with what I was talking about with Freud and his ideas of deep listening. That's exactly what we're talking about there. And then the third and fourth intentions of counsel are be spontaneous and be lean of expression. Goes back to what I'm saying. When somebody stops talking, don't go into automatically, I know more about that subject than you do. I'm not thinking about I'm not listening to what you're saying because I'm thinking about everything that I know. And oh God, when do I get to go so that I can talk about everything I know, right? That's what's going on in our brains. It's about, taking that step back, taking a breath, listening, truly hearing what is being said, and then allowing, then when it's your turn, just allow to whatever comes up. And it's kind of cool. I have done this in groups of people, and you can if you get the right group dynamics going on, you really can be in that kind of mindful, contemplative state, and keep your mind free and actually listen to what somebody else is saying. And it's really kind of cool how the conversation will just kind of naturally evolve on its own without everybody trying to pay me attention, me first, no, look at me, no, I'm more important, no, I'm going to speak the longest because I know the most about this. It really does change that whole dynamics quite a bit. And sometimes at the same time, and once again, guys, nobody's perfect. I can't say that I perfectly accomplish all of this. We all like to get excited when we're talking about stuff and maybe interrupt people, and it's just, once again, we're all works in process. We just got to keep working on it. And so that leads then to, once again, lean of expression. It just goes back. It doesn't matter if you are the foremost, number one authoritarian source on psychology. If you get in a group of other people, you need to step back and let them talk too. Just goes back to what I'm saying. Lean of expression. Don't think that you know everything and you have all the answers, that you just keep talking and don't allow anybody else to participate or engage in that discussion. Because once again, that goes back to these key parts of what it means to be human. We are social creatures who need each other, and so we have to engage each other, and we have to engage in discourse as conflict, and discourse as in just spoken communication with each other too. And that all goes back to these ideas of compassion, respect, and understanding. A little bit of why we do our mindfulness practice at the beginning of class too. And it's all just about creating those deeper senses of community and being able to share with each other. And so basically, I just kind of summarize all that on this slide here, emphasizing those points about, when we work together, that's how we move forward positively in society. And because, we have the ability to communicate as